It was a great day in the village. A new child had been born, as was the custom in the village, which was arranged in a circle at the edge of the ocean. All the villagers lined up outside the family's hut to welcome the newborn. One by one they entered the family's hut and walked across the sand to view the infant. If you had been standing in that line, you might have been confused. One person would walk out of the hut, and their face was smiling. They had just seen a new child. And yet the very next person would walk out of the hut with a face that was ashen gray. It looked like they had just seen death. You might have wondered why that was, until it was your turn to go into the hut. You bent down and entered the hut, walked across the semi-darkness to the other side. There, lying in a bed of seagrass, was a child. But it was only half a child. And I mean that literally. The child only had the left side of her head, a left arm, the left side of her torso, and her left leg. That was all. Imagine what it would be like to grow up half like that. She could not do many of the things other villagers could do. She began to get frustrated, and her frustration turned to anger. Like most of us, the first people she took her anger out on were the people closest to her. When her mother would ask her to help, she would pretend not to hear. When her father asked her to go to the hills and gather firewood, she would refuse. And when she could no longer get satisfaction out of displeasing her parents, she began to spread her anger towards other people in the village. It was not long before no one in the village would speak to the girl, and she was speaking to no one. At that moment, when all the villagers were angry with her, and she was angry with them, something happened. Just before dawn, the oldest woman in the village went into the family's hut unannounced. She reached down and grabbed the girl's left hand, jerked her upright, and dragged her to the edge of the village. As she dropped the girl's hand, she slumped into a pile, still only half awake. The old woman looked down at her and said,
"You must go now."
The girl was afraid to look up at the old woman. She began to crawl away from the village, inland towards the mountains. At the end of that day, she had only made it to just below the crest of the first hill outside the village. She had never been that far away from her home. Exhausted from having no water and crawling and hopping all day, she fell asleep right in the middle of the pathway. She awoke in the morning, still thirsty, with the sun beating down on her. Too afraid to go home, she made it to the top of the hill and stopped. Do you know what she saw? There was a huge lake in the valley below her. She had never known it was there. She was so anxious to get water that she half crawled and half rolled down the hill to get to the lake as fast as she could. Just as she was turning off the main path to go on a smaller game trail down to the water's edge, her left eye caught motion ahead of her on the main path. Her father had trained her as a hunter to stop and be still when there was motion she did not understand, so she froze in her tracks. The shape approached her, and do you know what it was? It was another girl. And this girl was also a half girl, except this girl had only the right side of her head, a right arm, a right torso, and a right leg. Now, those of you who are smart about stories, you probably think the way this story ends is that those two half girls joined and lived happily ever after. But I want to warn you right now, that is not the way the story ends. As soon as those two girls were within striking distance of each other, they began to fight. It was a great battle, and they were so involved they didn't even know they were rolling, with their arms wrapped around each other towards the lake. They hit the water, and huge waves began to boil around them. Eventually, the water became absolutely calm. You could see the reflection of the mountains in the glassy surface. If you had been watching the place where the waves were boiling, You would not have noticed at the water's edge, where the water meets the sand, a finger was coming slowly out of the water, then another finger, then one whole hand. If you had been watching that hand come out of the water, you might not have seen that a few feet away, another hand was coming out of the water, then a head, and it was a whole head. The girl emerged from the water whole, and like any newborn thing, she fell down when she tried to stand. She tried to stand again and fell down. 7 times she tried to stand up before she finally got both of her legs underneath her. She slowly began the walk back towards her village. With 2 legs, the walk was much faster. She went up the game trail, got on the main path. She went up the hill, down the other side, and walked across the plains towards her village. As she approached the village, do you know what she saw? The old woman, the one who had sent her away, was still standing there. She had never left the spot where she had dropped the girl's hands. As the girl walked up to her, she was afraid, not knowing how the old woman would respond. There was a long silence as she stood in front of the woman looking down. Finally, she had the courage to look up in her eyes, and the old woman looked down at her and said,
Welcome home. We have been waiting for you.
She took the girl to the center of the village, and it is said that everyone in the village danced, ate, and sang for 3 days to celebrate the return of the girl. On the morning of the 3rd day, with everyone still dancing, a runner came from the edge of the village. The crowd stopped in order to get the news. She said excitedly,
A new child has been born.
As the villagers all began to walk towards the family's hut to pay their respects to the newborn child, the half-girl, who was now whole, raced to the front of the line, eager to be the first one to welcome the newborn child into the world. And that is the story of the half-girl.